Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you're listening to The Sounds of Film. And boy, I am so excited to have on the phone with us today one of my favorite people, Howard Bloom. He's an author of many books that you've probably heard of called The Lucifer Principle, The God Problem, How I Accidentally Started the Sixties, that's his latest one, and The Muhammad Code, among others. You also probably know Howard for being a well-known publicist in the music industry for many years. He's worked with Michael Jackson, Prince, Billy Joel, Run DMC, and many other artists. He's been involved in lots of science-related projects as well. He hosts a podcast. I believe there's some documentaries being made about him. Howard, thank you so much today for joining us on The Sounds of Film.
Tom, it's a pleasure to hear you.
Oh, Howard, it's funny. Besides doing this show, just to let you know, I'm a teacher as well.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things I noticed a long time ago was that in any grade, there was always a handful of kids, a small number of kids, who were exceptionally bright. And these kids not only got great grades, but also were like the kids that ran every club. They played music. Sometimes they did sports too. And teachers would go to these students for anything. And they were just amazing. And, I always wondered, like, how could it be that just a few people could do so much? And, when I look at your career and everything that you've done, I mean, you just kind of strike me as one of those people, probably one of the best people in the world at that sort of thing.
Well, I wasn't one of those kids, Tom. My first grade teacher called my mom in and said, "You've got to take him for psychological testing. He's mentally retarded." My third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh grade teachers couldn't stand my guts because all I did was read two books a day under the school desk, and I never paid attention to anything that they had to say. I got my education the hard way, reading. I got into theoretical physics and microbiology at the age of 10, and those were my big things in life, science. And teachers had nothing to do with it, unfortunately, poor babies. I wouldn't have wanted to be one of my teachers. Being ignored hurts.
Well, I'm not surprised because, I mean, when I read a lot of criticism of schools, and I've seen a lot of stuff myself. I don't know if you know who John Taylor Gatto is.
No.
But he's a real critic, or he was a real critic of the education system, and believed that it can really penalize someone like yourself,
right.
who really wants to learn.
I was very lucky because when it came to high school, my parents sent me off to a school that was one of the first progressive schools in the country. And John Dewey himself, one of his acolytes, came up to Buffalo, New York to found it. But it was Dewey who was apparently the hand in the sock puppet, who was guiding the formation of the school. And this school saved my life. It did involve me. I mean, even though kids wanted to have nothing to do with me, they had a weird system. If you were a popular kid, you could run for class president, class vice president, class treasurer, and all that stuff. And if you were the most popular boy, you became the president. The second most popular boy became vice president, the most popular Jew, and you became treasurer, and the most popular woman, and you became secretary. Well, I was never going to be voted into any of those positions, but they had this brilliant system where they set up a whole bunch of committees to actually do things, like to put together booths for a fundraising fair. And you would get into a room with a bunch of kids who hate your guts, and you let them all piss on their own territory. You let them all mark out what they think is their greatness, and you wait until they're all finished. And then 10 minutes or 15 minutes into the meeting, they run out of things to say, and they have no clue as to what to do next. So even if you are the guy that they kicked soccer balls into the face of, and you open your mouth at that point, and you have an idea of what to do, all of a sudden you became a leader. So in that school for 4 years, kids put me in leadership positions, not because they liked me, but because they needed to get these loads they didn't know how to handle off their back. It was brilliant. And then I did research at Rutgers Graduate School of Education for 6 months. So education's been one of my dozens of interests.
Well, do you have any kind of conclusions in terms of what does represent the best kind of educational system, or do you think it's different for different people?
I'm sure it's different for different people, but for kids who don't respond well to structure, which I did not respond well to structure, letting kids or encouraging kids to follow their curiosity, which is the basic idea behind the Dewey system, the progressive school system, is terrific. And then I worked on the opposite when I was at Rutgers. B.F. Skinner, who was the dominant figure in psychology in the mid-20th century, had basically concluded that minds don't exist. So as a psychologist, he was a good person to leave behind and rebel against. But he'd also invented a system he called programmed learning. And in programmed learning, you put a paragraph on a page describing a simple concept, and at the end of the page, you let your pupil mark some check boxes indicating, well, it takes a quiz, in essence, to see if he understands the concept. And if he does understand the concept, he goes on to the next page. Now, here's the trick. Programmed learning is really a discipline of the writer. If you're writing one of these programs that presents simple concepts until you get to the end of an entire subject, like, for example, B.F. Skinnerian style psychology, there was a big programmed learning textbook on that. If on any page, any student gets the answer wrong at the end of the page, that is not the student's failure. That is your failure as a writer. And you have to go back and rewrite that paragraph, divide it into 2 paragraphs, whatever it takes to make it so crystal clear that every single one of your students gets it. And I designed one on the nomenclature of electrical wiring. You know, the most thrilling subject in the world, obviously. Everybody wants to know that.
Right.
And I took it to Douglas College, which was at that point a girls' college. Girls were the least people likely to want to understand this. And I tested the programmed learning booklet on girl after girl after girl. Every single one of them knew everything in there by the time they were finished, even though this was not a subject that interests them. So at one end of the spectrum, you have Dewey, follow your curiosities. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have a guided way to lead people through a subject they will never be curious about, and to get them to understand it nonetheless. So that's just an illustration of what you just proposed, which is there are many different systems for many different kinds of students because people are very different.
Well, one of the things, whatever you're talking about, that always kind of fascinated me with you is that you are curious, and you seem to have this passion to follow your interests wherever they may go. You know, one of the areas in particular that I hear you write about and talk about a great deal is that you seem to have this interest mainly in like artists who are able to connect with an audience in almost like a spiritual way, and what the connection is between like those types of artists and what happens when people have a religious experience or a drug-induced experience.
Well, you were smack dab on target. When I was 12 or 13 years old, I realized that I was an atheist. And about that time, I realized that there was something that I didn't see going on in the synagogue my parents used to try to drag me to. It was a very Lutheran-style synagogue. It had hard wooden pews that were jammed up against each other so tight that once you got in, you couldn't get out, and you simply stood up when the rabbi told you to, and you sat down when the rabbi told you to, and there were books in front of you on the back of the pew in front of you. And I thought that was monstrous, and I somehow intuited that there was a religious experience beyond that. And the religious, I call it finding the gods inside now. I didn't then. But that there was some sort of ecstatic experience that would yank you out of yourself, that would make you feel a part of something much bigger than yourself, that would clench you in an ecstasy, a state of exhilaration wildly out of your control for anywhere from minutes to hours. And I started finding evidence of that in Black Orpheus, the film, which is about Macumba rituals in South America, where through drumming and chanting, somebody all of a sudden gets up and has what looks like an epileptic fit and falls to the floor, frothing at the mouth for hours. Seized by the god, in this case by Chango, the thunder god of the Yoruban religion, or Christ, as Chango was transformed into in North American versions of this religion. James Baldwin has an incredible scene in Go Tell It on the Mountain, where he is seized and possessed by Christ and rolls on the floor and has epileptic fits. And I went out in search of that kind of experience. I didn't leave my theoretical physics behind. I didn't leave my microbiology behind. I just added this to it. So when I heard of a book at the age of 14, the book was not 14 years old, I was, but when I was 14 and heard of a book called The Varieties of the Religious Experience, it was like a call directly to my soul. And as a consequence, we didn't have Amazon in those days. It took me 4 months to find a copy of the book, and once I found it, it was like William James, the founder of modern American psychology, laying out a set of laboratory specimens on the table, all of the kind of ecstatic religious experiences I was just describing, and saying, look, it's 1905, I don't have the tools to understand these things, but when you come along 60 years later, you will. And I want you to pursue these laboratory specimens and come to understand them. So that became one of my scientific quests in life, and it was only by accident that I landed in rock and roll and founded the biggest PR firm in the music industry at the time. But it turns out that rock and roll was where the gods are. Rock and roll is where these ecstatic experiences happen. They used to happen to my artists on stage. They had happened to me once on stage when I was 16, and in that high school I was describing. I had an experience where it was an out-of-body experience while I was performing. It was astonishing. The energy of the audience came pouring into me as if the audience had become a giant amoeba, a single body of energy, reached out a pseudopod like a tunnel, and all of that energy from the audience was going through me and through me as if I were an empty pipe up to something I didn't know, and being utterly transmogrified and then being channeled back to the audience. It was a reverberatory loop, a feedback loop, and it was an astonishing experience. And when it was over, the audience crowded down to the foot of the stage, and they did something they had never done before in my experience in that school, and they never would do again. They picked me up on their shoulders, carried me out of the auditorium, carried me up the walkway to the building where we had classes, and then finally put me down. So I knew what it was to be Prince on stage, or to be Michael Jackson on stage, or to be John Mellencamp on stage, and to be an empty pipe for a while. So by accident, through rock and roll, because Tom, I had no right to be in rock and roll. I had no right to be in popular culture. It had never been my culture. I didn't know anything about it. But boy, was I glad I landed in the right spot to find the gods inside.
Well, I want to get into the music, but before we do, something current. I noticed recently you spoke with Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
And, I'd kind of like to get your take on what's going on with him. I think that it seemed to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that he seemed to be very much in agreement with a lot of your theories. And it helped me, listening to you talk to him, better understand, I think, some of the things that Peterson's been talking about recently that he's not crystal clear about. And what I'm referring to specifically is he talks very often about how he feels that Bible stories are very, very important. I think he believes that they're important in terms of what they have done for man throughout evolution.
Right.
And that they still today do hold important meaning to people.
Right.
But he doesn't ever come out and say that he's a believer. Now, I've heard you say you don't believe in God.
No, I'm an atheist.
Yeah. So what's going on with him in terms of what exactly he believes, your take on it, and also why is this confusing message of his for a lot of people so popular right now at this moment in time?
Well, there are two different topics there. One, Jordan's first book is called Maps of Meaning. And
Right.
It came out, 10 years ago or something like that. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's a Jung-inspired analysis of myth and religious mythology. And he sees so much meaning in that stuff, and he makes it so meaningful to you that it's amazing. I met him because in roughly 2000, when I was stuck in a bed for 15 years with a serious illness, I put together, using my computer next to the bed, I put together my third scientific group. I'd already founded two scientific groups while I was laying there sick in bed. And the new one was called the Science of the Soul Initiative. And 13 very fairly high-ranking scientists immediately signed on, and one of them was Jordan Peterson. So when I reconnected, when I put out How I Accidentally Started the Sixties, I just went through a methodical list of everybody who could get me any kind of exposure for this book. And on the list was Jordan Peterson, and he had a podcast. And I thought, okay, I'll get in touch with Jordan. It'd be nice to talk to him again. He probably only has about 200 viewers, and we'll see if he'll have me on, even for the sake of the 200 viewers. What I didn't realize is that Jordan Peterson had become a phenomenon, a religion. And so he had me on his podcast, and the last time I looked, we had 110,000 views. Jordan was much bigger than I thought. And then he had his publisher send me a copy of his upcoming book, which 12, what does it say over there? 12 Rules for Life. I'm looking at the cover. And so I read the book. The first 20 pages was very powerful. It was a summarization of evolutionary psychology, and it was brilliant. It was really terrific. And they asked me if I'd read a blurb for the book. Well, I didn't really understand the rest of the book. All I got from it was this sort of Nordic cold attitude toward life. But those first 20 pages were just amazing. So I wrote a blurb, because, who imagined the book would go anywhere, and it's right smack dab in the middle of the back cover of the book, and it came out and became Amazon's best-selling book, #1 book for a month, maybe a little bit longer. So when it comes to the Jordan Peterson phenomena, he starts with being anti-PC, anti-political correctness. Well, I'm anti-political correctness, too. But he sort of is from the right, and there are a lot of young people these days, I mean teens and in their 20s and even in their early 30s, who are very attracted to the kind of authoritarian, grim, cold philosophy that he manages to get across somehow. And they're clustering around him and God knows who else. I mean, Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
When I did the Joe Rogan show, that episode had about 720,000 or 740,000, three-quarters of a million views so far. But Jerome Kagan, the research psychologist at Harvard University, used to say that about 15% of any population, whether it's a population of mice, kittens, or human beings, is born oversensitive. Another 15% is born undersensitive. And in the middle, you've got the remaining 70% who are in between. Well, there have got to be philosophies for those who are oversensitive. There have got to be philosophies for those that are undersensitive. Fortunately, we're born in many different psychological forms, emotional forms, and each emotional form demands a different kind of worldview. And the worldview of Jordan's, for whatever reason, is extremely popular with those kids who need this kind of haughty, cold, Norwegian sense of things. I wish they'd all go back and read Maps of Meaning. It's a really terrific book.
We're speaking with Howard Bloom, whose latest book is I Accidentally Started the Sixties.
Actually, How I Accidentally Started the
Yes,
60s.
I'm sorry. And there's a lot of good information in there, too. You mentioned Rogan, and what do you make of the fact that you mentioned the numbers when you were on there? I've heard numbers that are just astronomical.
Well, 3.5 million subscribers is approximately.
Yeah, and then sometimes during a month, he might have as many as 20 million people checking in with him, either on YouTube or through the podcast.
Well, he's very clever. I don't know what is responsible for that incredible magnetism that he has, although people who make themselves full-time podcasters or YouTubers can build up their numbers tremendously. But one of his tricks is he did with me a 3-hour interview. Then he takes that interview apart and chops it into a lot of little bits, each having to do with a different topic. So in addition to running his full-scale interview, his full-length interview, he runs all these little interviews with individual hooks, individual headlines. And the synergy between these two is apparently terrific. But what the Joe Rogan phenomena is, why so many people are watching him, well, when I appeared on the show, I flew back from L.A. He's in L.A., and I'd been out there to do a number of things, and I, among other things, to see Wendy and Lisa from Prince's band. Mm-hmm. And I flew back to New York, and all of a sudden, wherever I went, people recognized me and said, I just saw you on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I even went down to Washington, and somebody recognized me down there. All these guys they were all men. They were all about 30 years old to 32 years old. They tended to be extremely good-looking men, and that seems to be his audience. And I don't understand the phenomenon entirely. I'm very glad that Joe is interested in me.
Well, I don't know if it's just Joe, because it is you, and it's Peterson, and I mean, it's a whole host of people. And I'm almost kind of curious if if this was you at a different point in your life, and how you were doing the publicity for the music industry. I almost wonder like what it would be like if all of a sudden you were able to have some control over all these different characters in podcasting, like where you would take it.
Well, I myself am a left-wing liberal,
right?
A standard liberal, which is and my audience. Joe Rogan has 3.5 million people subscribing to his YouTube. I have only 16,000 people subscribing to mine, and many of them are Trumpists, and many of them are way over on the right. And so when I do something that might appeal to them, they watch it. I mean, I did a Michael Jackson video about 6 days ago, and it's had 55,000 hits so far.
Yeah, I saw that.
But if I do something that's from my perspective, from my political perspective, from a left perspective, I get much, much fewer people viewing it. So even I, strangely enough, have a partially right-wing following. And that is chilling when you realize what just happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, where 50 people were killed. And they were 50 people killed by the kind of philosophy that Jordan Peterson espouses. Joe Rogan may come close to it. And these guys are not to blame, because the fact is that any good thing in overdose is a poison. And there are some people who've taken this white supremacist point of view to extremes and believe that there's a white genocide going on and that the white race has to rebel against it and expel all foreigners from its white homelands. And that's where this guy in New Zealand who killed the 50 people at 2 mosques was coming from. So that's an extreme. That's not Jordan's fault or anybody else's fault. It's the fault of people who are who hold up as their heroes. Timothy McVeigh and Anders Breivik, or whatever his name is, the guy in Norway or Sweden who gunned down a whole island full of white liberal teenagers who were activists and getting together for a summer camp for liberal activist kids. And it's mass murderers on the very white side that the guy in New Zealand looked up to.
Yeah. Well, that's all very sad and unfortunate. But I think one of the good things that come out of a lot of these different podcasts is that we get to hear people like yourself, Sam Harris, and other people talking about science a lot, and religion and philosophy. And, Sam Harris, for example, to just touch one more time on Peterson, has had several really well-watched debates about God and religion and atheism and the Bible. And, that's to me surprising that there are so many people that are interested in talking about these topics. And you're someone who talks about these topics as well.
And I constantly, because look at the names of my books.
Yeah.
The first book was The Lucifer Principle, a scientific expedition into the forces of history. The newer book was The God Problem, How a Godless Cosmos Creates. There's The Muhammad Code, How a Desert Prophet Brought You ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram. That's 3 out of my 7 books. And then there's an upcoming one coming out in about 14 months called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. And it's about this quest for that religious experience, the experience of the divine from the point of view of an atheist, and the quest in the rock and roll area, and my adventures, which are, I have a tendency to get stuck in some very peculiar adventures.
Yeah.
But so all 4 of those books have this common, you could call it spiritual thread. Some people have called me a material mystic. Frankly, I like the title. When I was hitchhiking and riding the rails out on the West Coast in the early 1960s and accidentally helping found the hippie movement, which is in how I accidentally started the 60s, for reasons too complex to go into here, I ended up in the office of the Mormon Bishop of San Diego. And the Mormon Bishop of San Diego sat me down and said, write something on a piece of paper. I am a graphologist, or whatever the word is for people who read handwriting. And he looked at what I'd written, and he said, you're the most spiritual person I've ever met. Well, I took that as a compliment. Now, he may have had some clues. I was barefoot and had been barefoot for 6 months, even in the snow of Seattle. Even walking over gravel, your feet get used to this kind of stuff after a while. My hair was long in a time when no one had ever seen a long haircut on a man yet, and no one had even imagined what a haircut or lack of haircut on a man with curly hair might be. The only thing that came close to that was Harpo Marx's wig. So these then, and I was dressed in jeans and a big baggy white sweater. So my looks were a dead giveaway. I looked like Isaiah, having just wandered in from the desert.
That's fine.
With a pair of jeans, which Isaiah didn't have the privilege of. But one way or the other, I was tremendously flattered because, I've been in search of the spiritual experience and for a long, long time now, most of my life, and it's still, from a scientific point of view, it's one of the great mysteries.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about music. You mentioned Wendy and Lisa, who I've actually had on the program, and I have to tell you, I am. Everyone says I'm the biggest fan of, but I think that Prince was just a rare individual, an artist, and I love your description of him, because one of the things that I like when I've heard you talk about music is how, especially when you talk about Michael Jackson as well, how some of these people seem unworldly, like that they're not like you and me in many ways. And
well, Prince is like you and me too. If you're a workaholic, I'm a workaholic. The only thing I really enjoy in life is working. That's not true, but I enjoy some other things, but in real moderation. So I work basically all my waking hours 7 days a week, and I'll work for years and years and years without any vacation. Prince was a workaholic. He could not live without making music. Elton John, back in the early 1970s, when Norman Winter, his publicist, first coined the term superstar in order to publicize Elton John had a problem. Music was so important to him that he was writing songs all the time. And when you're just starting out, you can put out 2 albums a year. That means about 22 songs. Then when you get bigger, you can only put out 1 album a year, 11 songs. And when you get even bigger than that, you can only put out 1 album every 2 years. You can't saturate the public. You always have to leave them hungry. Well, that was a huge problem, because here was all this bottled up music in Elton John. Well, Elton John looks lazy compared to Prince. Prince needed to make music more than he needed to eat or breathe. He just needed to make it with every cell of his being, every waking hour of the day, and probably in his sleep. And his solution was to come up with a whole bunch of proteges. The first one was Vanity. Yeah. And so he shipped me out to Minneapolis and said, give Vanity the education and how to do press, is the kind of education you gave me. And she was wonderful and lovely. And then I was sick in a bed for 6 months with a different physical problem, a back problem of all things. And they flew Morris Day into my out to Brooklyn. They flew him to New York, put him in a limo, brought him out to Brooklyn, brought him up to my incredibly messy apartment to go through this, because he was the second of the proteges. And then there was protege after protege after protege, and all of these were like sock puppets through which Prince attempted to make his own music, because the music just spilled out of him nonstop. One of the most amazing stories is when Lisa, from Wendy and Lisa, was flown out to Minneapolis to audition for Prince. And you would think, she was taken out to Prince's mansion in the middle of the night, and you would think he would sit her down and have a conversation using words. No, that wasn't Prince's primary medium. He sat her down in a room that had 2 baby grands, and you know how you can put 2 baby grands back to back and they fit each other like a big square?
Right.
And the 2 of them sat at keyboards opposite each other, and for the next 3 hours they had a musical conversation. And that musical conversation was Prince's interview with Wendy. He was interviewing the musical part of her. The other part didn't matter.
That's incredible. I'm curious for your insight. I've heard you talk about Prince quite a bit, and how you were with him at that critical point in his career where he just exploded, the Purple Rain era, and a little bit past it.
Well, I was actually there well before it. In 1981, I used to read. There were at that point 3 music trade papers, and they came in on Monday morning, and I used to read them from cover to cover, and had know an awful lot of what was in them by the time 1 o'clock rolled around on Monday afternoon. And I noticed on the R&B charts, the black charts, there was this artist whose record was rising and rising and rising, and then went platinum. And I never heard of him before, and I didn't see any press about him anywhere. I couldn't learn anything about him. Of course, we didn't have Google in those days, but even if we had Google, there would have been nothing, absolutely nothing. And then one day I got basically a call saying, do you want to work on this new artist that Earth, Wind, and Fire's manager, Bob Cavallo, is working with? And his name is Prince. Well, I recognize that name because I've been tracking this guy's records on the charts, and I've been tracking his anonymity. So I was brought in on a case when Prince was a complete and utter unknown. I mean, obviously somebody must have known something about him in the black community, or he couldn't have gone platinum. But actually, all they needed to know was his music to make him platinum. So I was with Prince from, it's not the very beginning. He'd already had an album or 2 albums out, but it was the very beginning of the serious aspect of his career.
Can I ask you, you mentioned Wendy and Lisa before, and I know that you really brought some important focus in terms of selling Prince to the public and what he should do. You had your suggestions for him, although he was always in charge. But there are some people that wonder, like when he let you go, when he let Wendy and Lisa and the whole revolution go.
And Bob Cavallo, his manager, who was brilliant.
I mean, the music was never the same after that. And I've heard you give an explanation as to why he changed. But I always wondered, did Wendy and Lisa, not just because there's that little storyline in the movie, but did they have a really big influence on his sound?
Well, I don't know about his sound, but they had a huge influence on his life. Remember, Wendy's sister almost married Prince. Maybe she even did. I mean, what was going on basically was this. Once upon a time, I flew out to Seymour, Indiana, to do my secular shaman-style interviews, very intense interviews. Interviews in which I sought your soul. I sought to get to know the part of you that did dance you on stage, that did write your lyrics when you thought you could never write another lyric again. And I was doing that with John Mellencamp. And John Mellencamp had grown up with a couple of movies, one of which was HUD. So John sat me down. I mean, these had been tremendously formative influences on his life, Paul Newman movies. And he sat me down and showed me HUD, which I had never seen before. And in HUD, there's this kid whose father is a rich cattle rancher, and he has a big white Cadillac convertible, and every day he drives his white Cadillac convertible from the ranch into town, and he goes to the bar and he picks up some other guy's wife, and he has his way with her, and she has her way with him, and that's his lifestyle. And then suddenly the state officials show up, and agriculture officials, and tell his dad there's a hoof and mouth disease not far from here, and we need to stop it. So we're going to have to kill your whole herd. Now, killing your whole herd means destroying the family wealth. That's destroying your 501k or whatever it's called. It's destroying your entire bank account. And HUD is against this because if they destroy the herd, he won't be able to go into town in his white Cadillac and pick up women anymore. He'll be poor. And his father gives him a stern moral lecture on your obligation to your fellow human beings. And HUD starts fomenting a plot to steal all of the cattle in the middle of the night and sell them off, which means if they have hoof and mouth disease, they're going to spread hoof and mouth disease all over the place. And then finally HUD wakes up to the urgency of his father's point of view, to the ethical, the moral point of view. And so John said, the message of this film is this. First, you rebel against your father, then you become your father. And it was a brilliant formulation, and that's what was happening to Prince. Prince was the scamp, the rebel. Here I had accidentally helped start the 60s in 1961 and 1962. Prince had picked up on the themes that my 60s generation had left behind, with things like Paisley Park and his interest in psychedelia and his belief that unfettered sexuality will end violence. So that was Prince the Rebel. But then, you've probably heard me say this, but one day I went to a concert at Nassau Coliseum.
Oh, right here.
Yes, exactly. And Prince's shows are always brilliant. He's one of the most incredible performers I've ever seen in my life, or was, unfortunately. And his light shows are utterly phenomenal. They're just brilliant. So here was Prince doing an absolutely brilliant performance, and then suddenly he was laying on the stage, humping it, and his body went still. And everybody thought, yeah, this is part of the act. We'll just wait until he gets up again. And then he didn't get up, and everybody began to get worried. And we wondered if something had happened, if he's had a heart attack or something like that. And eventually, a voice came from the ceiling. Now, if you know the ceiling at Nassau Coliseum, it's about 6 stories up.
Yeah, it's up there.
And this voice came from the ceiling. And guess what it was, Tom? It was the voice of God.
Yeah.
It was the voice of God talking to Prince. Now, what does that mean? The voice of God had started talking within Prince, because he wrote God's words for this. And what does that mean? It means the voice of his father was coming alive in Prince. And then Prince fired all of us because he was going through a conversion. He was turning from the scamp, the rebel, into his father. And his father was a jazz musician. Prince's brilliance was that he could do white music or black music. In other words, he could do rhythm-heavy music, he could do funk, or he could do melodic music like When Doves Cry.
Yeah.
And the melodic aspect tended to disappear. Plus, Prince lost his contact with his audience, and I was saved by the existence of the Internet when I was stuck in bed. Well, Prince was saved by the Internet, too, because it took a long time. It took about 8 years. And then Prince was able to found an online community. And since Prince was 5'2", roughly, it took me a year working with him before I realized he wasn't taller than I was. He was much shorter. And it's not easy to be shorter than I am. Prince was afraid of men. He let me into his world for about 2.5 years, and then I had to do his PR from a distance for the rest of the time. People were astonished that he even let me into his world. So here was Prince, who's uncomfortable with one-on-one experiences with men, not with women. He loves women, or loved women. And using an internet platform to interface with his audience gave him the opportunity to talk to all kinds of people and listen to all kinds of people without being close enough to be afraid of them.
It's amazing. Man, there's so much I want to talk to you about. I wish we had time to talk about Purple Rain and Under the Cherry Moon, but I do want to move on a little bit. This is Long Island. This is Billy Joel country, and a lot of people probably want to hear a little something from you about the time that you worked with Billy Joel. Where was he at that point in his career, and what did you suggest for him that he needed to do?
He had huge hits, but the press loathed him. They absolutely loathed him. Robert Hilburn, I think it was, at the LA Times, had actually run a giant story, one of those stories that fills a page and a half, comparing Billy Joel to Bob Seger. And Hilburn's point was that Bob Seger wrote brilliant lyrics, and Billy Joel wrote hackneyed lyrics. Well, he was absolutely wrong. Of the two great musicians of the 20th century whose words are likely to appear in poetry books in the late 21st century, the two majors are Paul Simon, who's just a staggeringly brilliant songwriter, and Billy Joel. Billy Joel's lyrics are sharp. They are engaging. They are original. And so my task with Billy Joel was to turn the press around and get them to see his merits. because Billy Joel is phenomenal, period. And the press was missing that. So that's what we did. We turned the press around. And Billy called it guerrilla publicity. I hadn't thought of it that way. But, I went out to Oyster Bay when we were talking about whether we should work together or not, and I explained the approach that I used and the approach that I would use for him, and Billy was apparently floored, bless his soul.
So what did you do?
So he liked the guerrilla publicity approach, and it worked. And it was dependent. I used to call it perceptual engineering, but something like perceptual engineering could be used for good or for evil, and my task was to use it to reveal truths that people hadn't seen.
So how do you do that, though? Like, how do you convert these journalists who were writing all these negative things to start writing positive things?
Well, first of all, if you were my client, I gave you a simple speech. I said, look, if you expect me to craft an artificial mask for you, an image, and tell you that it's going to make you a star, I'll get you an appointment within 2 hours with my best competitor. They do that. I don't. You have to understand that music is not an exchange of plastic. It is not an exchange of downloads. It's not an exchange of money. It's an exchange of human soul. And that means I have to step into you and go down to the very depths of you to find the soul that makes your music, the God inside of you, the soul inside of you. And if you understand that and are willing to go along with it, and if you'll give me a month to study you insanely, and then you'll let me come out to wherever you are so I can see you in your own environment with no wives, no managers, nobody else in the room at all. My task will be secular shamanism, finding the soul, your soul. And you can hear I'm straining with curse words here. And if you were willing to go for that, then I would work with you. So it starts with finding a truth in the artist so deep that the artist doesn't even know it's there. That a truth so deep that it comes alive and dances the artist like a marionette on stage, or writes his lyrics for him on a good day, and that's part of him. But it's buried, it's deep below the floorboards of the self. And so dealing with truth, I could go to the press. And the press is a very conformist bunch. They all follow each other's lead. It's like a herd of sheep.
Yeah.
And once upon a time, the social commentator, Thomas Carlyle, in 1837, wrote about a naturalist friend of his who'd gone out into the countryside. And now, I don't know if you've ever seen these lanes. If you're ever tired of walking the country and farmland, there are often these 2 rows of poplar trees, and there's this little black lane. And if you make a mistake of taking a date on one of these lanes, you can only walk single file in the lane. So you have to have your hand uncomfortably behind you, leading your date of the night or day along. Well, the reason those trails are so deep, and the reason they're there, is for sheep. Sheep travel in single file down these lanes. So the naturalist saw the first sheep coming. The bell sheep, they called it in those days. We would call it the alpha sheep. He took his walking stick and he stuck it out in front of the lead sheep. The lead sheep jumped over it. He kept it in place for sheep number 2. Sheep number 2, the beta sheep, jumped over it. Then he withdrew his cane, and guess what happened with the other 2,000 sheep? They all jumped at precisely that location, even though there was nothing to jump over anymore. And the press are like that herd of sheep. So my task was to, in other words, what a couple of lead sheep loved, everybody else in the press community loved. What a couple of lead sheep hated, everybody else in the press hated. So I would look for lead sheep, people with the New York Times, the Village Voice, Rolling Stone, who were mavericks for some reason and who didn't go along with the other sheep. And I would sit them down for lunch, and I would spend 3 hours. We were always the last ones there, and I would spend 3 hours telling the stories of this artist's soul as I had learned it in that one-day brutal session that could last 7 hours, 9 hours, 12 hours with the artist. I did one of those with Prince. I did one of them with John Mellencamp. It was a standard part of what I did. And they would begin to get it. Now, in the case of John Mellencamp, it took 3 years of this to get it across to them. They didn't believe me. They were interested, but they didn't believe me. Ken Emerson, who at that point had been the lead, the review editor at Rolling Stone, and now was at the New York Times Sunday Magazine, I heard this third hand, told people, if you really want to get a story, you have to go to Howard Bloom. He's the only one in the industry who knows how to tell a story. It was a matter of telling these stories that got across who the artist was. So for 3 years I did this with John Mellencamp, and the press, which loathed him, wouldn't listen. And then one day he did a concert at Radio City Music Hall, right in the middle of Manhattan, and Polygram Records sprung for a party in the red velvet-lined basement room of Radio City Music Hall. It's a gorgeous room. And one by one, the lead figures in the press walked up to me, and each did the same thing. They grabbed me by my forearms, and they looked me very much in the eye from a very short distance, and they said, "You were right. You were right."
Wow.
But it took 3 years of persistence, and thank God John was willing to pay for a publicist through 3 straight years.
Wow.
Prince also, Prince paid for a publicist, me, for 7 years, until finally his father's voice inside of him got the better of him.
I just want to remind our listeners that that there's publicists and then there's publicists, and that you were a special creature in the sense that, I mean, you have a rich science background.
Yes, exactly.
You're a writer, and that you really brought all of your logic and all of your skill and all of your creativity and all your wisdom to something that I don't know that kind of stuff is usually brought to publicity in all cases.
Well, I didn't really feel my job was publicity. My staff's job was publicity.
Yeah.
My job was to find the soul inside of you. My job was to know all the ins and outs of career building. My job was to look over your manager and see where he was strong and where he was weak, and to, without ever telling anybody about it, to fill in for the manager on his weak spots so that your career would really blossom. But again, this what we're calling a spiritual element, understanding that souls are speaking through music somehow and are rounding up other souls and giving them a sense of identity and a sense of a right to be. This was very much at the heart of what I was doing. And remember, I was trying to understand all of this from a scientific point of view. So Danny Goldberg, who has been the president of Polygram Records and Atlantic Records, said in his book, Stumbling into Genius, that Howard Bloom did not regard publicity as something you do to satisfy the egos of vain rock stars. He saw it as an applied science. And yes, I did, except with the magic addendum that it was a science of the soul, even though no science of the soul exists in science at the moment. It was what William James tried to bring into being. When you get to read my book, Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, Search for Soul and the Power Bits of Rock and Roll, you'll see how I went after it. But even I don't have definitive answers about what soul is. I can tell you that, once upon a time, a cognitive scientist of my acquaintance, who was also a jazz musician, was playing with 3 other guys, jazz. And there's a certain point, and this used to happen to these 3-4 guys often. There's a certain point where they lost their sense of individual identity and were no longer playing to each other, but there was a higher music in the room to which they were all playing. We call it in science an emergent property. And groups have a collective soul. And when you have that sense of ecstatic, out-of-body experience, you've been yanked out of yourself and something else is taking you over, that's a moment where you make contact with that higher self, with the self of the group, the soul of the group, not just your individual soul. Now, what do I mean by the soul of a group? Tom, you are 100 trillion cells. And yet somehow those 100 trillion cells cooperate in making something you call Tom. And the trick is that no individual cell has any clue that there is a Tom Needham, or even of what a Tom Needham could possibly be. And yet they are all participating in making a Tom Needham. Well, you and I are cells in larger social organisms, superorganisms, we call them in science, and in my first book, The Lucifer Principle. And we are blind to the larger personality of the group itself. Why? Because we're just individual cells. But in those moments of ecstatic experience that are at the heart of music and entertainment in general, you make contact with the personality of that larger whole of the group. And for a minute or two, possibly 70 minutes if you're going on stage and performing, it seizes you, it holds you, it flows through you. And then you're dropped again. And once upon a time, Peter Townsend and George Harrison were trying to get Eric Clapton off of heroin. And George Harrison wrote a song that includes every single name of candy in a mixed assorted candy box. It's a wonderful song.
Right.
It's the one that has the words Montelle Mort. You might wonder how those got into a song. It's because when you are doing a lot of heroin, like Eric Clapton was, apparently you eat a lot of candy. But Peter Townsend had a much more practical approach. He went to Eric and he said, look, I know why you are doing heroin. You go on stage in front of 17,000 people. For 70 minutes, you have the souls of 70,000 people 17,000 people flowing through you to the Godhead. And in the Godhead, all of that energy is utterly transmogrified, utterly changed, and it flows back down through you to the audience as if you were an empty pipe. So for 70 minutes, the souls of 70,000 people and the Godhead are flowing through you. Then the concert ends and you step off stage. The lights are no longer on you, the audience is no longer there, and the souls of 17,000 plus the Godhead that filled you are gone. And you are an empty pipe, and you ache. And you try to fill that ache with heroin. It was one of the best descriptions of the performing experience that I've ever seen. It fit my performance when I was 16 years old, and it explained why, when John Mellencamp walked off stage, he looked as if he had no eyes. He looked as if his eye sockets were just hollow darknesses. His face had lost all form of animation. There was no sign that there was any sort of personality in Mellencamp. And he was led back to the dressing room, and there was a little tiny room off of the dressing room that he sat in for the next 70 or 80 minutes. And only his wife was allowed to be in there with him, and once I was allowed to be in there with him. Now, Tom, why would this happen? It happens because you were just filled with the souls of 17,000 people and the Godhead, and now you're empty, and it takes a long time. You think your personality is just automatic the minute you wake up. No, it's not. Your personality takes another 70 minutes. Your normal, hello, how are you, fine, thank you very much personality. It takes a time to come back into you. The only person I don't think had these problems was Michael Jackson.
Well, that's the person I want to ask you about it. Do you have a couple more minutes, or?
Absolutely.
Okay. Obviously, he's in the news again because of the HBO documentary. But
right.
Before we even talk about that, I love to listen to you talk about what a special person he was.
Well, he was amazing. He had a quality of astonishment that I never imagined seeing in my life, that I didn't even think a human being was capable of. He had the capacity to see the infinite in the tiniest of things. The story that gets this across is the fact that one day I was in Encino, California, in Marlon Jackson's pool house, which is a one-room building with 2 floors. So actually it's a 2-room building. It has 1 room on the first floor that occupies the whole building, and a second on the second floor, a second room. And we were supposed to see the art director for CBS because there was an upcoming Victory album, because of the Victory tour, and the brothers were going to look at various artists to determine which one they liked to do their cover. So there I was standing, because the brothers regarded me almost as another brother. They really took my advice very seriously, and they were very grateful to have me, bless their souls. And so I had just met Michael a few minutes before, and we all stood at the big billiard table that dominated the center of the room, and the brothers flanked us, and Michael and I stood with my right elbow next to Michael's right elbow. And the art director slid the first portfolio across the table, and Michael opened it just enough to see an inch of the illustration. An inch. This great big 2 foot by 3 foot or 11 by 18 or something like that illustration. Barely seeing anything at all. And his knees bent. And he went, ooh. and you could tell he was seeing more than the artist had ever seen in that square inch. And then he opened up another little bit, and he went, ooh, and his knees bent even further. Ooh, ooh. He was having aesthetic orgasms. It was the most astonishing thing I'd ever seen in my life, and I've seen a lot of astonishing things. To me, when I was 10, the first two rules of science and the rules that got me engaged in science, made science my lifelong everything, my religion, if you will, were these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, then proceed from there. The first rule is the rule of courage. The second rule is the rule of awe and wonder. Michael was awe and a wonder incarnate. And in my next major episode with Michael, I would see that he was committed to the truth at any price, including your life, too. He embodied everything that I believed in ways I had never imagined could possibly be. And he's one of the only two people on this planet. And, my address book, which is 3,100 pages long, contains the names of literally tens of thousands of people. I've known a lot of people. But Michael was one of the only two who I'd ever thought of as a saint or an angel, because he was so utterly beyond the human norm. And I've always felt that if people just understood what Michael really was, it would set a new standard for humanity. And when you set new standards, you change the whole perceptual and achievement envelope of the human race. When in 1954, no one had ever run the 5-minute mile, and it was regarded as probably impossible. And then a guy named Roger Bannister put a little team together, and they did some extremely cagey analysis of how he was using his feet and his legs when he was running, and they got him to run with extraordinary efficiency, and he broke the 4-minute mile. Well, for thousands of years, nobody had ever broken the 4-minute mile, but once Roger Bannister did it, one person after another, after another, after another did it. It suddenly became possible. Michael sets one of those standards in terms of awe, wonder, and commitment to truth that is utterly beyond anything you've ever seen in your life, and if people can come to understand it, it can expand their capacity. It can expand what they strive for in their lives. I had an artist named Bill Chinick. Now, Bill Chinick was not a distinguished songwriter, and he was not a distinguished singer, but he did things to the guitar that you've never heard in your life before. So one day, Bill Chinick was playing a little club in New Jersey. Clubs were all he could get because his music was fairly mediocre, unfortunately. And there was a little old man in the back of the audience. And when everybody else left, and the little old man had his mouth agape. And when everybody else left, the little old man came down to the foot of the stage and said, "Son, how did you do that?" And Bill Chinick is a very sweet man. Said, "Well, sir, I was a fan of Les Paul when I was a kid, and I put Les Paul records on the turntable, and I sat there with my guitar, and I worked year after year after year until I could finally play like Les Paul." And the little old man said, "Son, I am Les Paul. Don't you realize I invented multi-tracking?" In other words, Bill Chinick had learned to play like 8 Les Pauls.
Wow.
So the message of that is once you set a standard, other people can achieve it. It's just a matter of understanding the standard.
Right.
Michael set a new standard in what humans were capable of, and I hope that in my book, Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, which unfortunately won't be out for 14 months, September or October of 2020, I hope that the book gives you a sense of that. So you can care, if you like Michael Jackson, if you tend to be an agnostic about whether these sexual claims are true, we have no way of knowing. I have no way of knowing. I never saw any evidence, none, in the time that I was working with Michael. But if you feel Michael Jackson was important to you, and you don't understand why, and you don't understand why you need to hang on to him, despite everything that's being said about him right now, this book will tell you why you were right all along and what Michael Jackson represented in terms of human capability.
Howard, do you have any opinions about, this is coming up a lot, not with just Michael, but other artists who have been tarnished because of like the Me Too movement and other issues. Can you separate an artist from their personal deeds if they've done something?
Well, that's the big question that I raised. I have a YouTube video out that came out about 5 days ago, I think, on Michael, and it's had 55,000 hits so far. And it raises the question of how do you maintain the best of what people were? Because humanity needs it, because it could be history changing, in the light of knowing some of their foibles. And it points out that if we discarded people for their sexual practices, JFK, we would never have listened, we would never have heard the words, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. We would have never heard the words, we choose to do it, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Because he was sleeping with another woman almost every night, including Marilyn Monroe, despite having kids, a wife, and being in the White House. The Secret Service was helping sneak these women and him into these sexual encounters. There's Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi used to sleep with another young, nubile woman nude in his bed every single night. And sometimes these were the very young wives of friends of his, people he knew, people he'd ordered not to have sex with their wives. Now, Mahatma Gandhi never had sex with these women, but he was sexually obsessed. And if we had thrown away Mahatma Gandhi, we would never have gotten Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King, when he was out on the road, was sleeping with women like crazy. Ralph Abernathy, in his autobiography, tells you about this. And if we had looked only at his sexual life and not at what he offered positively, we would have missed out on I Have a Dream. So the big question with Michael is, what do we do about these sexual accusations? It's impossible to tell if they're true, and a whole bunch of people on the internet, on YouTube in particular, have torn these two guys apart, which is unfortunate. The two guys in the film, Leaving Neverland, the two guys who claim that Michael Jackson seduced them when they were kids. And who knows if these claims are true? An awful lot of YouTubers who've gone through the film inch by inch say it's not true at all. But we do have to hold on to the positive contributions of people who are frail. All I know about Michael Jackson's sex life is that when we were traveling on the Victory Tour, we used to occupy the two top floors of whatever the ritziest hotel was in town, and Michael was up on the top floor, and I was down below on the second from the top floor. And when I went upstairs, which I did a lot, Michael had this gorgeous 40-ish woman, much older than he was, 15 years older or something like that, a matron who had kids and a husband and who'd gotten the permission of her kids and husband to go out on the road with Michael Jackson. And she had an adjoining room with a door that allowed the two rooms to connect. Was there anything sexual going on? Well, I think that if there was, her husband wouldn't have said yes to going out on the road with Michael Jackson. Every night before he did a show, and this was supposed to be secret, he had two kids with cancer who were dying, who wanted more than anything else in life to meet Michael Jackson. He had two of them brought backstage, and that's how he warmed up for going on stage, which most artists would just stay in a room all by themselves trying to psych themselves up. Not Michael. Yes, he loved kids. Remember, Michael Jackson never had a childhood.
Mm-hmm.
From the age of 9, he was doing major performances with his brothers. And from the age of 6, he and his brothers were stealing their father's guitar from the closet where his father used to keep it, and they were practicing in secret. And so Michael never had a childhood. Well, there's something called childhood deprivation. There's also something called play deprivation. And Jaak Panksepp is the scientist. He was a friend who came up with play deprivation. Michael suffered from childhood deprivation, and that was what made children so important to him. He loved kids, but that doesn't mean he loved them sexually. He loved them. He felt that it was his job, that since God had given him the gift of this awe and wonder that I've just described, it was his job to pass that on to his kids. And in one confrontation with Michael, it was an extremely important one. It's described in the YouTube video. It's described in the book, the upcoming book. I felt as if I had a vision. Michael's ribs were golden gates, and those golden gates opened, and inside of them I saw 10,000 of Michael's kids, and he was going to protect those kids no matter what it cost him. He was going to absolutely protect them. So the stories in Leaving Neverland are very credible. They sound like something that could easily have happened. But whether they did, who knows? We'll probably never know.
Well, you've had so many experiences with so many very interesting people, but people find you interesting too. And I know we have to wrap this up, but I understand that there's some films being made about you.
Yes, 2 films. One is called Surf the Catastrophe. I mean, remember, I was sick in a bed for 15 years, and I couldn't speak for 5 years, and yet I was able to put 3 international scientific groups together and put 2 international scientific groups together, and I was able to write 3 books. That's Surfing the Catastrophe. That's taking every disaster and turning it into an opportunity. So that's a 70-minute film. Brick TV is making it. The director is Charlie Hoxie, and he's won 3 Emmys, and it should be coming within a couple of months. The second film is based on my dinner with Andre, where the filmmaker sits somebody down with an interesting person, and it becomes a feature film. It was a major film at the time, and it's my dinner with Howard, and the person interviewing me is Noel B. Murphy, who is first of all, the guy making the official film about the life of Buckminster Fuller, and secondly, as a comedian. So it's the 2 of us together in front of a camera, probably at the Algonquin Hotel, because Noel likes the ambience, the fact that witty people used to hang out there. Witty people, Tom, wouldn't have had anything to do with me. I'm an outsider even in groups of outsiders. And that's one of my great benefits in life, that I'm just stuck being an outsider, because it gives me perspectives that other people don't have, the way it gave me perspectives, that of my science background, in the music industry. I could look at the traditions of the industry, the traditions for publicity, and not have any emotional attachment to any of them, and simply and if it didn't work, I discarded it and replaced it with something that did work. And it was devilishly effective, but it was devilishly effective on the basis of a soul deep truth.
Wow. Well, I don't know what to say. I can't wait to see that movie. I've had Wallace Shawn on the program. That's one of my favorite films, My Dinner with Andre. And,
right.
and obviously I'm a big fan of your work, so I can't imagine how great this movie is going to be. Howard, I want to thank you so much for coming on The Sounds of Film. I want to recommend to our listeners that you check out his books, The Lucifer Principle, The God Problem, How I Accidentally Started the Sixties, the Muhammad Code, and also look for these films that are coming out. And you have a website too, right, where all your work is?
.net.
Exactly. Howard, thank you so much. I can't wait to talk to you again. Hopefully we can do it in the future.
Okay, Tom, it's a pleasure. I'll see you soon.
Okay, thanks again. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.